Hung by her wrists from a cottonwood limb, Della Whitlock didn't know a stranger already. Watching would change everything before sundown. The branch above her groaned with every breath she fought for, and the river below carried the smell of turned mud and coming rain. 3 men lounged in the shade, laughing the greasy laugh of men who believe the land already belongs to them. Their leader stood apart in the tall grass, patient, counting her fear the way another man counts coin. Then, from the willows on the far bank, a horse stepped out of the shadow, a rider in a weathered green poncho, hat pulled low, a voice like a blade dragged slow across a stone. "Release her." Nobody on that river bank breathed. Not even the horses. Spring 1887. In the Wyoming Territory, in the hard, hungry season, after the worst winter the high plains had ever handed a rancher. Her name was Della Whitlock, 23 years old, the county sheriff's only daughter, and in about 4 minutes she was going to watch a stranger take apart 3 armed men without raising his voice above a whisper. I've told enough of these frontier stories to know how most of them end. Badly, or half badly, which is worse, because half bad convinces you the world is fair when it isn't. Stay with me to the end, because before that Cottonwood stopped groaning, a debt got collected that nobody in that town expected to see paid. Now let me back this wagon up about 10 days, because you need to understand exactly how a sheriff's daughter ends up dangling over a riverbank with her wrists lashed together, and exactly what kind of man decides mid-ride in the middle of nowhere that today is the day he stops being a man who rides past trouble. The winter before had a name before it was even finished killing things. Men up and down the territory were already calling it the Big Die-Up, and they said it the way you'd say the name of somebody who'd wronged you personally. It came down out of Canada in November, and it did not let go until March. Storm stacked on storm, 40 below, with a wind that turned a man's breath to ice on his own mustache before he'd finished exhaling it. Cattle drifted with their tails to the wind until the wind ran out of country, and then they died standing up, packed against fence lines and coulee walls and windrows so thick a rider could walk his horse across their backs without touching ground. Come the thaw, ranchers who'd run 10,000 head the autumn before rode out to count maybe 1,500 living, and there wasn't a bank in the territory that had any patience left for a man who couldn't make his note. One of those ranchers was named Silas Rourke, and until that winter he had been, by every account I could find, a decent man. Not a soft one. Nobody soft survives long enough to build the kind of spread Rourke had built along Antelope Creek, but decent. The kind of man who paid his hands on time and pulled a stranger's wagon out of a bog without being asked twice. The winter took 80% of his herd, and every dollar of credit the Cheyenne Bank was willing to extend him, and it left behind a man who had discovered the way some men do only once in a lifetime, that the ground under his feet was not as solid as he'd believed. Grief does strange arithmetic in a man like that. Rourke did not mourn his cattle. He got angry at the land itself, and then, because you cannot shoot land, he went looking for something that could be shot, or squeezed, or forced to give back what the winter had taken. The Cheyenne and Northern Railway had been creeping its line west for 2 years, and that spring its surveyors were driving iron stakes into pasture land up and down the valley, sighting a corridor that would cut straight through the bottomland along the river. The kind a railroad will pay real money to lay track across if the deed holder is willing to sell the right-of-way. Rourke did not own that bottomland. He never had. The deeds to nearly every acre the surveyors wanted lay in an iron safe inside the Larkin's Ford Courthouse, recorded there 2 decades earlier when the valley was still being carved up by men with more patience than money, and the man who held the combination to that safe, and the legal authority to say yes or no to a railroad corridor crossing county land, was the sheriff. Sheriff Amos Whitlock had worn a badge in Larkin's Ford for 11 years, and in all that time he had never once been accused of hurrying a decision. He believed in warrants. He believed a man was owed a hearing before he was owed a rope, which was an unfashionable belief in some quarters, and had gotten him shot at twice, though not killed, on account of him being a better hand with a rifle than most men expected from someone who read law books in the evening. He had 1 child, a daughter, and he had raised her alone since the fever took her mother, when Della was 11. And if you had asked him what he was proudest of in this life, it would not have been the badge. Della Whitlock rode like she'd been born already mounted, which, according to the midwife who delivered her, was close to true. Her mother had gone into labor 3 days early, out checking a fence line on horseback, and had barely made it back to town. She was sharp in a way that made some of the Larkin's Ford matrons uneasy, quick with a rifle, quicker with her opinions, and thoroughly tired of being treated like a piece of her father's furniture that needed dusting and protecting. She'd grown up watching Amos Whitlock hold the line between the valley's decent people and its predators, and some part of her had decided, somewhere around age 15, that she intended to be useful in that fight rather than ornamental beside it. It made her father proud, and it made him afraid, in roughly equal measure, and he never quite worked out how to tell her so, without sounding like he was trying to clip her wings. Silas Rourke did not intend to ask the sheriff nicely for a right-of-way. He had tried nicely, in fact, back in the winter's immediate aftermath, offering to broker the railroad's corridor deal in exchange for a cut that would have covered his debts twice over, and Amos Whitlock, being a man who read law books, had told him the county's land process didn't work by private brokerage, that the deeds belonged to the recorded owners and the corridor would be negotiated properly in the open through the courthouse the way the law required. It was the correct answer. It was also, to a man standing at the edge of ruin, with a railroad's money glittering just out of reach, an infuriating one. So Rourke built himself a different kind of leverage. He kept on what remained of his payroll 3 men who had ridden with him through better years and had not left when the herd died, either from loyalty or because they had nowhere better to go, which in a hard year amounts to the same thing. The first was a broad, slow-moving man named Gully, built like a stove and about as gentle, a man who solved most disagreements by simply standing closer to people until they agreed with him. The second was a wiry, restless hand called Nash, quick on the draw and quicker to lose his nerve once the shooting actually started, the kind of man who talked tough in a bunkhouse and went pale in a real fight. The third, and the one Rourke trusted most for the ugliest work, was a lean, soft-spoken man everyone called Ambrose, who carried a pocket Bible he'd stopped reading for comfort years earlier and now quoted from memory, usually the fire and brimstone passages, usually right before he did something that made even Gully look away. Rourke's plan, when he finally laid it out to the 3 of them over a low fire on Antelope Creek, was simple in the way that cruel plans usually are. He did not intend to threaten the sheriff directly. A lawman expects threats and arms himself against them. He intended to take something the sheriff loved and force the man's hand through it in a way public enough that the whole valley would understand what obedience bought and what defiance cost. Word had gotten to Rourke, the way word gets to everyone eventually, in a county small enough that the church bell can be heard from both ends of it, that the sheriff's daughter had taken to riding out past the last fence line most mornings, alone, to pick the early wildflowers that came up along the grass line before the range cattle trampled them flat. Her father had told her more than once not to ride that far without company, not with rustlers working the county's edges and railroad money making otherwise sensible men reckless. Della had listened to that warning approximately as well as most 23-year-olds listen to warnings that interfere with something they enjoy, which is to say, she had nodded, agreed, it was probably wise, and kept riding out anyway. Because the wildflowers were prettiest at the grass line, and she was not about to let some hypothetical danger clip a habit that had never once cost her anything. On the 10th morning of that spring, it cost her everything she had. She rode out before the dew had burned off, the way she always did, her mare picking a familiar path along the fence and out past the last post into open range. And she was 3/4 of a mile from town, bent low over a stand of blue flax with her reins loop-loose over her saddle horn, quiet, as men who had practiced being quiet. She heard the horses too late. She got one hand to the little belt pistol her father insisted she carry, and a burlap hood came down over her head before she cleared leather, rough hands wrenching her wrists behind her and lashing them with a length of rawhide before she'd finished drawing the breath to scream. She screamed anyway, into the burlap, and somebody laughed, and that laugh, she would tell me later, or tell the version of this story that survived to be told, was the moment she understood this was not a robbery. Robbers do not laugh like men enjoying themselves. They rode her 2 hours north, along the river, blind and bound, listening to men she couldn't see, argue about how tight to keep the rope on her wrists, whether Rourke wanted her marked up or whether marked up served the purpose better. Ambrose settled the argument by quoting something about the wages of sin, which nobody else at the fire seemed to find as clarifying as he apparently did, and by midday they had her at a bend in the river where a single enormous cottonwood leaned out over the water, its lowest limb thick enough to hold the weight of a grown man, let alone a woman of Della's build. They did not intend to kill her. That distinction mattered enormously to Rourke, and mattered not at all to Della in the moment they threw the rope over that limb, hauled the slack through, and hoisted her off the ground by her bound wrists until her boots barely scraped the dirt, and every breath became a small, deliberate act of will. The hood came off. They wanted her seen. That was the whole design, and it was, in its way, more calculated than a bullet would have been. Larkin's Ford sat less than a mile downriver, close enough that word would travel inside the hour, and Rourke had chosen a bend visible from the road, so that anyone riding into town that afternoon, a public hanging of the sheriff's own daughter, by her wrists rather than her neck, timed and staged so that she would not die of it but would suffer through every minute of it in plain view. That was Rourke's message to Amos Whitlock. Hand over the deeds, or watch this happen to something you love again and again until you do. Gully, Nash, and Ambrose stood beneath the tree and let people see them standing there. That was the second part of the design. A masked man doing violence is a criminal to be hunted. 3 unmasked men standing calmly beneath the hanging woman, in daylight, close enough to town that anyone could ride out and look, communicated something else entirely. That they were not afraid of consequence, that the sheriff's authority did not reach as far as everyone had assumed, that the old rules about who could be touched and who couldn't had quietly stopped applying. A dozen townsfolk came out along the road that afternoon to see for themselves whether the rumor was true. Every one of them rode home again without doing a single thing to stop it, because 3 armed men with nothing left to lose are a math problem most unarmed farmers do not care to solve, and because, this is the part of the story that cost me something to tell you, a town that watches and does nothing is not innocent, even when every individual choice inside it is understandable. I want you to sit with that discomfort for a second, because it's going to matter later. Della did not give them a performance. That was the one thing they had not accounted for. He had expected herself to weep maybe, or beg, the way fear is supposed to make a person behave, and instead what came up in her, once the initial animal panic of the rope had passed, was something closer to fury. She cursed Rourke by name, though she did not yet know it, cursed his mother and his cattle and his railroad money, kicked dirt at Gully when he came close enough, and told Ambrose in language that would have scandalized every matron in Larkin's Ford. It did not stop what was happening to her. It did, in a strange way, keep her from breaking, because a person fighting is a person who has not yet surrendered, and Della Whitlock did not intend to surrender to 3 men and a 4th one watching from the grass. The 4th man was Rourke himself, and he stood apart from his hired hands, the way a foreman stands apart from a crew, close enough to direct the work and far enough to keep his own hands clean of it. He watched Della's wrists redden and her breath shorten with the patient attention of a man doing sums, weighing how many more hours of this it would take before word reached Amos Whitlock, and how many more hours after that before the sheriff arrived with the deeds folded in his saddlebag ready to trade. Rourke had convinced himself, in the ruined arithmetic of a man who has lost everything once already, that this was not cruelty so much as negotiation, that fear was simply a currency he was spending in order to survive, and that Amos Whitlock would understand, once the deeds changed hands, that Rourke had done what any desperate father-turned-desperate man might do. If these frontier stories keep you company, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It keeps this whole operation riding. Back to that riverbank and the sound of a horse stepping out of the willows. The man who rode up wore a poncho the color of old moss, faded from whatever green it had started as, and a hat pulled low enough that most of what you could make of his face was a jaw and the shadow of a mustache and a pair of eyes that did not appear to be in a hurry about anything. He rode a rangy buckskin gelding that moved like it trusted him completely, which tells you something about a man if you know how to read horses. He had come down off the high ground to the north, where he'd been making slow miles toward nowhere in particular, the way a certain kind of drifter always is, and the sound that had turned him off his line and down toward the river was not a scream. Dougly laughter of Gully, finding something funny at another human being's expense. He had heard that particular laugh before in other places, attached to other cruelties, and something in him had gotten tired, somewhere over the years, of riding on past it. He did not announce himself. He did not draw first. He walked the buckskin down the bank at an unhurried pace that Gully, Nash, and Ambrose all mistook, for about 4 seconds, for a lost traveler wandering into the wrong afternoon. Release her, again harder, and this time Gully understood it wasn't a suggestion. He reached for the revolver on his hip anyway, because a man built like a stove does not often believe he needs to be careful. The shot that answered him did not hit Gully. It hit the revolver, spinning it clean off his hip and into the dirt 6 feet away. And Gully stood there for a full second, staring at his own empty holster, with the particular confusion of a man who has never once in his whole violent life had his own gun taken from him faster than he could use it. Nash went for his own weapon in the same heartbeat, more out of reflex than courage, and the second shot took the pistol out of his hand entirely, along with enough of his trigger finger that he would spend the rest of that year favoring his left hand and telling a much braver version of this story in whatever saloon would still serve him. It was Ambrose who understood, fastest of the three, that the man in the poncho had not fired to kill either time, and Ambrose was also the one cruel and quick enough to do something about that understanding. He lunged for Della where she hung, got an arm around her, and dragged her sideways against his own body as a shield, his revolver coming up hard against her temple, and, I'll give you the quote exactly, because it's the kind of thing a man says when he thinks scripture excuses him, and I've decided today I'm righteous. Della did not wait to find out whether the stranger agreed with that theology. Bound wrists and all, dangling with her boots barely under her, she drove her elbow back into Ambrose's ribs with everything her fury had left in it. And it was not a graceful blow. But it did not need to be graceful. It needed only to move his gun hand off its line for the fraction of a second the drifter required. And Ambrose's arm dropped exactly that far for exactly that long. The third shot took the revolver clean out of Ambrose's fist before he'd finished cursing, and the drifter was off the buckskin and across the 6 remaining yards of riverbank before Ambrose had finished deciding whether to run. He didn't run far. None of them did. Once it became clear that the stranger in the poncho had put 3 men on the ground without a single bullet touching human flesh, which was somehow more frightening to Gully and Nash and Ambrose than if he'd simply killed them. A man who can do that and chooses not to is a man. And there is nothing hired muscle fears more than an opponent whose limits they can't calculate. They scattered into the brush, dragging Nash's ruined hand with them, and left their horses standing loose along the bank. The drifter did not chase them. He had one job left that mattered more than 3 fleeing men, and he crossed to the Cottonwood, drew a knife from his boot, and cut Della down before her arms had finished screaming with the strain of holding her up. She dropped into his arms harder than either of them expected, her legs unwilling to hold her weight after an hour of taking almost none of it, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because there is not always something to say in the first 10 seconds after your life gets handed back to you. Not quite a question. Once he had her steady on her feet and was working the rawhide off her wrists with careful, unhurried fingers. "You're the sheriff's daughter, Della Whitlock," she managed, her voice raw. "And you're going to tell me who in the hell you are, or I swear you'll what, not unkindly, faint on me. You've earned it, if you want to." She did not faint. She would later insist, to anyone who asked, that fainting had never once been on the table, though the drifter noted privately that her knees had a different opinion. What she did instead, once the rawhide fell away and blood came painfully back into her hands, was ask him his name again, and this time he gave her something, though not much. One word offered the way a man offers a coin he doesn't much need, but doesn't mind parting with. Qual. That'll do for now. There wasn't time for more than that. Rourke had heard the shots from wherever he'd retreated to when the shooting started. He had not notably stayed to fight himself, which tells you something about the difference between a man who orders cruelty and a man willing to risk his own hide delivering it, and within minutes the sound of riders coming hard along the river. Cole didn't wait to see how many. He got Della up onto the buckskin ahead of him, turned the horse away from the river, and up into the broken country to the west, and put distance between them and Rourke's men with the unhurried competence of someone who had done this exact thing, or something close enough to it, more times than he cared to count. He didn't ride the obvious lines. That was the first thing Della noticed, once her heart had slowed enough to notice anything beyond her own pulse, that Cole kept the buckskin to low ground, dry washes, the folds in the land that would keep them out of sight from a rider on higher ground. Doubling back once through a shallow creek bed to break their trail before angling northwest toward a formation of pale limestone bluffs that rose up out of the sagebrush like the bones of something old. It was smart riding, the kind that came from either a great deal of hard experience or a great deal of hard necessity, and probably both. You've run from men like that before. Somewhere in the second hour, when the adrenaline had burned off enough to let her think in full sentences again. More times than I'd like, man rides long enough, he collects enemies the way a coat collects burrs. You learn to ride like somebody's always about to be behind you, because eventually somebody usually is. He did not offer more than that, and she did not push, not yet, though she filed the answer away the way a sheriff's daughter learns to file things, for later, when it might matter. They reached the limestone bluffs as the light was going long and gold, and Cole led the buckskin along a dry creek bed to a cave mouth half hidden behind a fall of rock, a hollow the local Shoshone bands had used for shelter longer than anyone in Larkin's Ford had a name for. After a story nobody quite remembered the details of anymore. It was deep enough to hide a horse and two people and a small fire, shallow enough that a man could see both directions out of it, and Cole clearly knew it the way you know a place you've used before. If you've been enjoying how this one's unfolding, here's the part where I ask you to become a member of this channel. The join button is right there, beside my name, waiting. Inside the cave, with the fire small and low, though the light wouldn't carry, Cole finally gave Della the fuller shape of what she'd been caught inside of. He'd pieced together enough from the shouting on the river bank, Rourke's name, the mention of Deeds, the railroad, to understand the outline of it, and Della filled in the rest. The courthouse safe, the surveyor's stakes going into pasture land up and down the valley, her father's refusal to broker the corridor privately, the winter that had broken Rourke, and, apparently, whatever conscience he'd once had left with it. Cole turned a strip of dried meat over the coals. He'll come for the deeds through you. That's the whole plan. He can't take them from the safe himself, man, like your father won't hand over a combination to save his own hide. But he might hand it over to save yours. Rourke knows that. That's the only reason you're worth anything to him alive. So what happens when my father says no? She already suspected the answer. Then Rourke keeps raising the price until either your father breaks or Rourke does. And men who've already lost everything once don't break easy the second time. They've got nothing left to protect except the last thing they're holding on to, which is usually their own pride, and pride doesn't negotiate. She was quiet a moment, watching the fire, and then she asked him the question she'd apparently been circling since the riverbank. "Why'd you stop? You didn't know me, didn't know my father, didn't know a thing about deeds or railroads." You could have kept riding. Cole didn't answer right away, and when he did, his voice had gone lower, quieter, like he was handing her something he didn't often take out and look at himself. "I've ridden past situations like that one before," he said. "More than once told myself it wasn't my fight. That a stranger interfering usually makes things worse, not better. And mostly that's even true. but every time I've done it, it's cost me sleep I never got back. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a man who rode past something he shouldn't have. I got tired of that quiet a while back. Figured I'd rather carry a bullet than carry that. It was, Della would tell me later, the most he said about himself in 3 days of riding together, and she did not ask him to say more, because something in the way he'd said it told her that was already more than he'd meant to give. They did not get a full night's rest. Rourke was not a patient man even before the winter, and losing 3 of his own hired hands to a stranger's revolver had turned his fury into something closer to desperation, which is a worse thing to be hunted by than fury alone. He gathered the rest of his crew, 5 men this time, since Gully and Nash and Ambrose had straggled back to the ranch, too rattled and, in Nash's case, too wounded, to ride again that night, and put them on Della and Cole's trail with a lantern, tracking the buckskin's hoofprints along the creek bed toward the limestone bluffs. Cole heard them coming before Della did. He'd banked the fire down to almost nothing an hour earlier, some instinct telling him not to trust the quiet. And, when the first faint jingle of tack carried up the dry wash, he was already moving, settling Della back behind a fold of rock deep in the cave and pressing a spare revolver into her hands with instructions that were short and exact. "You don't fire unless somebody's inside arm's reach of you," he told her. "Out there, I've got room to work. In here you don't. Trust the dark." Then he went out to meet 5 men and a lantern, with nothing but a rifle, a revolver, and the particular calm of a man who had done this kind of arithmetic before, and come out the other side of it enough times to trust his own hands. He did not go out the front of the cave, which is what Rourke's men expected and were watching for. He went up and over through a gap in the rock he'd apparently marked on some earlier pass through this country, and came down behind the lantern-bearer's position in the dark, moving quiet as a man who had spent a great many nights of his life learning exactly how loud his own boots were. The lantern was the whole problem. From Cole's side of things, 5 armed men who could see him by its light, and 1 man who preferred the dark, were not good odds, and the fastest way to change bad odds is to remove whatever's making them bad. He came up behind the nearest rider first, close enough to lift the man's own rifle out of the saddle scabbard before the rider even registered a second person was near him, and used the butt of it hard enough to put the man face down in the sagebrush. Then, with 4 men left, and a lantern still throwing its circle of light across the creek bed, Cole put a single rifle round through the lantern's glass from 30 yards out, and the night came down over Rourke's remaining men like a dropped blanket. What followed was not a fair fight, exactly, though I want to be careful how I tell you that, because it wasn't a slaughter either. Cole moved through the dark with the advantage of a man whose eyes had adjusted to it and who knew exactly where every rock and gully in that creek bed sat, while 4 men who'd spent the last minute staring into a lantern flame groped blind and fired at shadows, at each other's shouted positions, at anything that moved. Cole dropped 2 of them with careful, deliberate shots that took shoulders and gun arms rather than lives, herded the remaining 2 into a stumbling retreat, with 3 rounds fired close enough to their boots to end any argument about whether to keep coming. Rourke's night raid had lost 7 men to Cole's revolver across 2 engagements without Cole taking so much as a graze, though he would admit, quietly, once it was over, that his hands weren't quite steady until he'd sat down. Della came out of the cave once the shooting stopped, the spare revolver still gripped tight in both hands, and found Cole crouched over the man he'd knocked unconscious, checking, with a thoroughness that surprised her, that the man was breathing, steady, and not bleeding anywhere that mattered. You could have killed all 5, not quite an accusation. More genuine curiosity could have, Cole agreed. Don't much care to, when I've got another way through. Dead men don't learn anything. Living ones sometimes do, though I'll grant you it's a poor percentage. He looked up at her, and something in his face in the low light looked older than it had on the riverbank that afternoon. Your father's going to have to decide something soon, Della. Rourke's not going to stop coming. Man, like that, having already lost this much, he'll burn the whole valley down before he admits he can't win it back. They did not sleep again that night. By first light, they were moving, working their way down out of the limestone country toward Larkin's Ford, because Cole had reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that Rourke's next move would be to bring the fight to the town itself, where the sheriff would be forced to choose between his daughter's safety and the county's. In front of every witness the valley had. Better, Cole judged, to reach Della's father before Rourke did, and get ahead of whatever came next, than to keep running blind through open country, with an increasingly desperate man's remaining hired guns somewhere behind them. They reached the edge of Larkin's Ford as the sun was fully up, tired, dust-streaked, Della's wrists still raw and bruised where the rawhide had bitten in, and the town was already stirring with the particular tension of a place that has heard rumors it doesn't yet know how to act on. Word of the riverbank hanging had reached town the day before, carried by the handful of people who'd ridden out to see for themselves, and Sheriff Amos Whitlock had spent the night since organizing what defense he could with a town that had exactly 1 deputy, a scattering of townsmen who owned rifles but had never fired one, and no idea where his daughter had been taken or whether she was alive. She was alive and riding into town on a stranger's buckskin at sunrise, which was the first good news Larkin's Ford had had in 2 days, right up until the moment somebody on the church steeple, keeping watch, called out that riders were coming from the north. A great many riders, more than the town had ever seen assembled outside of a cattle drive. Rourke had not come to negotiate. He had spent the ranch's last shreds of credibility and cash calling in every debt owed him, every hard case in 3 counties willing to ride for wages against a sheriff's office, and he came into Larkin's Ford at full light with nearly a dozen mounted men behind him, riding straight up the center of the main street like he already owned it. He stopped in front of the general store, and before anyone in town had gathered the nerve to challenge him, he'd hauled an elderly man, Otis Grable, who ran the feed store and had never done a violent thing in his 61 years, off the boardwalk and put a revolver to the old man's temple in plain view of half the town. "Sheriff Whitlock," Rourke called out, his voice carrying flat and hard across the dusty street. "You've got a daughter running loose with a stranger, and I've got Otis Grable's whole future in my trigger finger. I want the deeds. I want the courthouse safe opened, and I want that railroad corridor signed over to me free and clear, or I'm going to start proving to this town exactly how little it costs me to keep hurting people until you say yes." There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a street when everyone in it understands at the same moment that talking is no longer going to solve anything. Larkin's Ford went that quiet, and into it Amos Whitlock stepped out onto the courthouse steps with his rifle in his hands and a look on his face that Della, watching from behind the general store's corner, had never seen there before. Not fear exactly, but the particular grief of a father watching a choice he cannot make correctly close in around him from both directions at once. For God's sake, you might be thinking, watching this unfold, and I confess I thought it too, the first time I traced this story down. Just give him the deeds. I understand the instinct, but you have to understand what Rourke actually wanted them for. This was never going to end with a signature. A man desperate enough to hang a woman by her wrists over a riverbank does not become trustworthy the moment he's holding paper. Handing Rourke the deeds bought the town nothing but a delay before the next demand, and everybody standing in that street who'd lived through a hard winter or two understood that arithmetic without needing it explained. Cole understood it too, and he was already moving before the sheriff had finished shouting his answer down the street. He got Della and himself up onto the roof of the general store through a back stairwell before Rourke's men had fully organized around their leader's demand. Taking the high ground, the same instinct that had served him in the limestone cave. From the roof line, he had a clear field across the hitching posts where most of Rourke's riders had left their horses, and his first act, before a single shot was fired at a human being, was to put 3 rounds through the leather hitching straps and send the whole line of horses scattering in every direction and taking with them at a stroke most of Rourke's men's ability to retreat, reinforce, or maneuver as a mounted force. It was, I'll tell you plainly, about as smart a piece of gunfighting as I've come across in any of these stories. Not a single life taken, and half of Rourke's advantage gone in under 10 seconds. Rourke's men, deprived of their horses and their surprise both, scattered for cover, and what followed was not the tidy shootout of a dime novel, but the ugly, sprawling thing a real gunfight actually is. Men diving behind water troughs and porch posts, Otis Grable wrenching free of Rourke's grip in the confusion and stumbling for the feed store doorway. Shots cracking flat and hard off the false front buildings up and down the street. Della, from behind the general store's brick chimney, was not idle. She had grown up around her father's rifle and knew exactly how to use one, and when one of Rourke's men broke from cover to try flanking their rooftop position, she put him down with a single clean shot that dropped him into the dust of Larkin's Ford's main street and put an end, permanently, to his part in Silas Rourke's war. It was around then that Rourke, watching his numbers shrink and his control of the street collapsing, gave the order that turned a gunfight into something closer to a siege. "Burn it," he shouted to whichever of his men were close enough to hear him over the shooting, and within minutes a lit torch had gone through the open window of the feed store storage loft, catching dry hay and lumber with the ugly speed fire always finds in a dry spring. Cole, seeing the smoke start to climb, worked his way along the rooftops toward the feed store to get Otis Grable's remaining stock and, more urgently, a cornered pair of townsmen out of a loft that was rapidly becoming a trap, and it was there, in the smoke and the narrow space between roof beams, that Rourke's remaining men very nearly finished what the winter hadn't. Cole took a graze along his ribs from a shot fired too close for comfort, and for a handful of seconds, pinned in a loft with fire, climbing one wall and 3 armed men working their way up the outside stairs, it looked, from where Della crouched watching. Like the man who'd cut her down from a cottonwood limb, might not walk away from this street the way he'd walked into it. He got out the same way he'd gotten into the cave the night before, through a gap nobody had thought to watch, dropping from the loft window onto the awning below, and rolling clear into the alley before the fire. It cost him the graze along his ribs and most of the skin off one forearm, and it bought him exactly what he needed: distance and a clean line back to the fight. By the time Cole made it back to the main street, Rourke had understood that his siege was collapsing around him, half his men down or fled, his horses scattered to the 4 winds, the fire he'd ordered doing more to panic his own remaining crew, than to break the town's will. And he did what desperate men in a losing position have done since the beginning of every fight there's ever been. He grabbed the nearest person he could reach, and it happened to be Della, who had come down off the general store roof to help drag a water bucket line toward the burning feed store, and had, for one unguarded moment, put herself within Rourke's reach. He got an arm around her throat and a revolver against her ribs, hauling her backward into the open street, and called out across the smoke and the scattered gunfire for everyone, his own men, the sheriff, the stranger who'd cost him half his crew, to hold their fire, or watch the sheriff's daughter pay for every one of them. If you've seen even a handful of these stories, you already know the shape of what came next. But I'll tell it to you slow anyway, because it's worth telling slow. Cole stepped out into the middle of Larkin's Ford's main street, in full view of Rourke, in full view of the fire climbing the feed store wall, in full view of whatever remained of Rourke's crew and the whole town crouched behind whatever cover it could find. He simply walked unhurried, the same unhurried way he'd ridden that buckskin down the riverbank 2 days earlier, until he was close enough that Rourke could see his eyes. "Release her," he said, same 3 words. Same flat, quiet voice, like a debt come due. Rourke laughed, though there was nothing steady in it. "You're going to stand there and tell me to let her go with your own rib bleeding through your shirt and half my men still standing? I don't think you're in a position to tell me anything, stranger. I'm not asking a second time. I already did that once, back at the river. Figured I'd give you the same courtesy twice." What Rourke did not account for, what Rourke in the whole arc of his ruin had consistently failed to account for, was Della Whitlock's own willingness to fight for the last inch of her own freedom. She had spent 2 days being hung, hunted, shot at, and dragged through a burning street, and she had precisely no patience left for being used as a bargaining chip by a man whose cattle troubles were not in any way her fault. She drove her boot heel down and back into Rourke's shin with every ounce of fury she'd been carrying since that cottonwood limb, and the blow was sharp enough, unexpected enough, that his grip loosened and his gun arm dropped just off its line exactly, precisely, the fraction of a second Cole needed. His shot took the revolver clean out of Rourke's hand, same as it had taken Gully's and Nash's and Ambrose's 2 days before, spinning it into the dirt of the main street, and this time Rourke's remaining hired men who had ridden for wages, not conviction, men who had signed on to this because Rourke was paying and not because they shared his desperation, took one look at their disarmed, beaten leader standing alone in the middle of a burning street, and did what hired men have always done at the exact moment loyalty stops being profitable. They scattered, mounting whatever horses they could catch, and riding out of Larkin's Ford without so much as a backward glance at the man who'd hired them. Silas Rourke stood alone in the street, disarmed, defeated, and, for the first time since the big die-up had taken his cattle, and, with them, whatever certainty he'd once had about his own life, entirely out of moves. If any part of this has had your knuckles white on an invisible set of reins, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe before you go. It genuinely helps a small channel like this one keep telling stories that deserve telling. Sheriff Amos Whitlock reached the street a few minutes later, having spent the worst of the fighting organizing what defense he could around the courthouse and the townsfolk sheltering inside it. And the sight that met him, his daughter standing on her own 2 feet in the smoke-hazed street, bruised and exhausted and entirely gloriously alive, undid something in him that 11 years of wearing a badge had not managed to undo. He crossed the distance between them at something close to a run, which was not a dignified pace for a county sheriff, and neither of them cared. "I thought," he started and couldn't finish it, which told Della more than the sentence would have. "I know," she said, and let him hold on to her exactly as long as he needed to, which was longer than either of them would probably admit later. It was some minutes before Amos Whitlock turned his attention to the man in the dust-streaked poncho, standing a little apart from the reunion, blood drying along one rib where the grays had caught him, watching the whole scene with the particular stillness of a man who was already, mentally, halfway back onto his horse. "I don't know your name, Cole. That's all there is to know, most days." "You saved this county's future," Amos Whitlock said, and he meant it plainly. Without embellishment, Rourke's men, once scattered, would be rounded up over the following days without much further trouble, Rourke himself taken into custody on the spot, and the courthouse safe, with its deeds and its railroad corridor question, would go on being decided the slow, correct, legal way the sheriff had always insisted on. None of that would have happened, and Amos Whitlock knew it without needing to be told, if a stranger hadn't turned his horse down toward a riverbank 2 days earlier because he'd gotten tired of a particular kind of quiet. "I'd be obliged," the sheriff went on, "if you'd let me pin a badge on you. County could use a man who thinks the way you think, under fire. God knows we're short deputies today." Cole considered it longer than Della expected him to. Long enough that, for a moment, she thought he might actually say yes, might actually stay, and she was surprised by how much she found herself hoping he would. "A badge is a bright target with a pin attached," he said it finally, not unkindly. "I've collected enough targets in this life without volunteering for another one. You've got a good town here, Sheriff? Good enough. It doesn't need me standing in the middle of it reminding everybody what happened this week. Best thing I can do for Larkin's Ford now is let it get back to being ordinary." He stayed 2 more days, long enough for the graze along his ribs to close over, and for the town to bury the men who hadn't survived Rooftop Siege, and to begin, in the slow, patient way small towns always do, rebuilding the corner of the feed store the fire had taken. Della sat with him more than once on the courthouse steps in those 2 days, and neither of them said much of consequence, because there was not in the end a great deal that needed saying. She had watched him ride into her worst afternoon and take it apart with his bare competence and his refusal to kill more than the situation required. And he had watched her break a grown man's grip with a boot heel, rather than wait passively to be rescued, and both of them understood without needing it spelled out exactly what kind of person the other one was. On the 3rd morning, before the town was fully awake, Cole saddled the buckskin at first light and found Della already waiting by the hitching post, arms crossed, doing a poor job of pretending she hadn't gotten up early on purpose. "You're not staying, not a question. Trail doesn't end here for me, never does, much as I've tried a few times to make it stop somewhere. I'm not built for a courthouse and a badge and a town that already knows my whole story. Men in my line of work does better work where nobody's watching him close enough to expect anything of him. Will I see you again?" He considered that, honestly, which she appreciated more than a comfortable lie would have earned him. "Can't say. Territory's big, and I go where trouble tells me to go, mostly. But I'll tell you this, wherever I end up, I expect I'll remember a woman who broke a man's grip with her own boot heel rather than wait on somebody else to save her. That's not a thing I forget easily. Stay safe, Della Whitlock. Keep your father's courage right at the center of you. Whole Valley's going to need it again someday, one way or another, and you're the one who'll have it in you when they do. He didn't look back as he rode west out of Larkin's Ford, and Della stood at the hitching post and watched him go until the buckskin was a small, dark shape against the pale morning country. And then nothing at all. And she would tell me, years later, when I finally tracked down enough of this story to ask her about it directly, that she had cried a little. Standing there alone, though she'd never been entirely sure whether it was grief or gratitude or some combination the English language doesn't have a clean word for. Della Whitlock went on to live what most people in Larkin's Ford would call a full and good life. She married, some years afterward, a steady rancher named Everett Cade, who'd rebuilt his own place after the big die-up-the-hard, patient way, without ever once asking her to be smaller than she was. And she raised 3 children who grew up hearing the story of the Cottonwood and the Drifter told and retold at the supper table until it had taken on the polished half-legendary shape that true stories get when a family loves them enough to keep repeating them. She never became sheriff herself, though there were more than a few years when the county badly wanted her to, and she never stopped. Every spring when the cottonwoods along the river came back into leaf and the branch by the old crossing groaned faintly in the wind, saying the same 2 words it had said the first time it mattered. Silas Rourke served out his sentence in the territorial prison at Laramie, and was never, as far as any record I could find, shows released to trouble the valley again. Gully and Nash and Ambrose, scattered to whatever corners of the territory, would still have men with their particular reputations, and none of them, again as far as the record shows, ever hung another woman from another tree. The railroad corridor was eventually negotiated properly through the courthouse, the slow legal way Amos Whitlock had always insisted on, and the Cheyenne and Northern Railway's line went through the valley 3 years later without a single further act of violence attached to it. On glamorous process winning out in the end over the man who'd tried to skip past it with a rope and a rifle. And Cole the man, Larkin's Ford would remember only by that one syllable and a faded green poncho, rode on into the rest of whatever life a man like that lives, appearing, according to the scattered fragments I've been able to piece together over the years, in a handful of other stories in other counties. Always the same pattern. A stranger who rode past enough trouble once to know exactly what it cost him, and who decided, somewhere along a lonely stretch of territory, that he'd rather carry a bullet than carry that particular quiet ever again. I keep coming back, telling these stories, to the same plain idea, and I'll leave you with it here the same way I found it. Courage isn't the absence of fear, and it isn't even most of the time some grand gift a person is born with. It's a decision, made in an ordinary moment. To stand up when sitting down would have been so much easier to put yourself, deliberately, between somebody vulnerable and somebody violent, knowing full well it might cost you everything you've got. Della Whitlock made that decision with a boot heel in a burning street. Cole made it first, alone, on a quiet riverbank, when nobody was watching and nobody would have blamed him for riding on. Neither of them set out to be remembered for it. That, I think, is usually how the real ones happen. If this story found its way to you today, tell me in the comments where you'd have wanted the trail to take Cole next. And if you haven't already, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It helps these stories keep writing.